It was a night colder than memory itself. The kind of London darkness that holds its breath between the river and the walls. When Captain John Dundas, stationed at the tower, looked out through a narrow window and saw something that would chase him through every dream for the rest of his life. Below him, a guard stood frozen in the courtyard, his bayonet raised, his body trembling like the wind-tossed flame of a candle. The man's face was white with terror, his eyes fixed on a figure gliding soundlessly across the stones. She was dressed in white silk, her gown trailing mist like breath. Her hands folded at her waist, as if she were on her way to chapel. But where her head should have been, there was nothing but air. A gap too clean, too final. The soldier screamed, lunged, and his blade passed straight through her. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone, leaving only the echo of her steps and the weight of a name that the Tower of London has never been able to bury. Anne Boleyn. Almost 500 years had already passed since the morning she knelt in the straw on Tower Green, since a French swordsman raised his blade and brought it down with the precision of a craftsman and the silence of a grave. Yet her story did not end where her body fell. If anything, that was where it began again, in whispers, in candlelight, in the eyes of those who swore they had seen her walking after midnight, still carrying the head that the king had ordered taken from her. Hers is the most persistent ghost in English history, the one that refuses to fade, the one that reminds the living that injustice is not so easily buried beneath royal marble. To understand why her soul still wanders, you must first remember who she was, the woman for whom Henry VIII broke his world in two. Before Anne, there was Catherine of Aragon, his queen for more than 20 years, pious and patient, yet unable to give him the son he demanded. Then came Anne, bright as fire, sharp as a sword, impossible to ignore. Henry fell not just in love, but into obsession. He tore England from Rome, severed centuries of faith, built a new church with himself at its head, all for the promise of her body, her wit, her eyes that never lowered even before a king. She was crowned in a storm of triumph. The nation split between awe and hatred, and then, 3 short years later, she was gone, accused of adultery, of treason, of crimes too absurd to name, tried in a court that never intended to hear her defense, condemned by the man who had once sworn eternity at her feet. But the tower remembers, the walls remember, and so does she. They say that Anne's ghost appears most often on the anniversary of her death. May 19th, the day she walked from her cell to the scaffold. Witnesses describe her as calm, almost serene, her face pale beneath a white cap, her hands clutching something invisible. Sometimes she is seen kneeling where she once died, lips moving in silent prayer, her body dissolving into the grey morning fog. Other times she walks, headless, across Tower Green, the long hem of her gown whispering through the grass, her figure glowing faintly in the half-light before dawn. Those who see her say she is not frightening, she is sorrow itself, shaped into a woman. But the tower is not her only home. In Norfolk, at Blickling Hall, the place where she was born, a coach is said to arrive each year on that same night. The horses are headless, their eyes burning with ghostly light, their hooves striking sparks against the gravel drive. Inside the carriage sits Anne, her white dress slowly turning crimson, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her severed head resting there like an offering. Locals say the coach races across the grounds until it vanishes at the door, leaving the echo of wheels and a faint scent of roses. No one dares look out of their window when they hear it. For those who meet Anne's eyes, if she still has them, are said to dream of her death until their own. At Hampton Court, where she once ruled as queen, she wanders differently. There she is, dressed not in white, but in blue or black, walking corridors that no longer exist. her feet climbing staircases that were sealed centuries ago. Some nights, guards see her pass through doors without touching them, her form gliding as if she still searches for something lost, perhaps the rooms Henry built for her but never finished. The apartments she was meant to inhabit as queen, before her arrest cut the dream short. Even in death, she still seems to be looking for her life. And yet, at Hever Castle, her childhood home, her ghost softens. There she appears around Christmas, dressed again in white, walking beneath the old oak trees, by the frozen moat. No blood, not head, no horror, only peace. Those who see her say she looks younger, almost happy, as though the years and the betrayals and the blade have been forgotten for a moment, as though the girl she once was has returned to walk where she first learned to love. Perhaps in that place, the haunting becomes a kind of remembering, a reclaiming of what was stolen from her. But the question remains, why does Anne Boleyn still walk when so many others rest? Why has her ghost outlasted kings, empires, wars, and centuries? Some say it is because she died innocent, and innocence demands witness. Others say she walks for her daughter, Elizabeth, the child she left behind, barely 3 years old, robbed of her title and mother on the same morning. Perhaps Anne's spirit cannot rest because her love was stronger than her death. Or perhaps she lingers because her story was twisted into lies for too long, her name blackened, her legacy denied, until history itself began to summon her back to set the record straight. Whatever binds her here, it is not rage, it is memory. Anne Boleyn is not the ghost of vengeance, she is the ghost of consequence. She haunts not to terrify, but to remind. Every time her figure is seen gliding through the tower's courtyard, every time a guard hears the rustle of silk where no woman stands, she returns to tell us that power without mercy is death without peace. Henry tried to erase her from history. Instead, he made her eternal. So when you stand beneath the shadow of the tower and the air turns colder, listen carefully. If you hear the echo of steps that are not your own, if you glimpse the edge of a white sleeve at the corner of your sight, do not run. You are in the presence of England's most restless queen, the woman who would not die. And as long as her story is told, Anne Boleyn will keep walking. Because some injustices echo forever, and some ghosts, once awakened, never sleep again. It was the morning of May 19th, in the year 1536. And the sky above the Tower of London was the colour of lead, neither truly dark nor light, but hovering somewhere in the in-between, the same place where Anne Boleyn now existed, not yet gone, no longer truly alive. The room where she woke was stone, cold, and without mercy. No fire crackled in the hearth, no morning sun spilled across the floor, only silence, and the distant sound of something being dragged across cobblestones. She knew what it was before the sound had a name. They were building her scaffold. Anne Boleyn rose from a night in which she had not slept. She had not wept either. She had prayed, hours and hours of prayer, whispered into the stone walls, her voice cracking, sometimes falling into silence, only to begin again. Like a lullaby, meant not for herself, but for her daughter Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, left behind in a palace far away, watched by strangers, too young to know that her mother's name had already been scratched from the future. Anne knew she would never see her again. She had held her one last time nearly a moon ago. She had kissed the child's pale cheek and whispered something that would never be remembered. And now, this morning, she would be made to vanish not by time, but by steel. She sat for a while on the narrow bed, her hands resting in her lap, her fingers no longer shaking. Outside, she could hear movement, the voices of men who did not know her name, the creak of timber as it was lifted and bolted into place, the soft roll of wagon wheels. bringing straw to soak the blood that would fall by noon. The Tower Chapel stood just a few steps away, and somewhere beyond it, Tower Green waited for her. 3 minutes' walk. That's what the constable had told her. From the door of her cell to the platform, 3 minutes. Long enough to hear the crowd breathe. Long enough to see the axe that would not be used. Long enough to forgive the man who would never speak her name again. Her ladies entered softly. They had dressed her many times before. In velvets. In gold. In silks, made for queens. But today the fabric was different. Grey wool, simple, dignified. Unbeiwille. It would not stain as badly. Over her shoulders they placed an ermine mantle, white and symbolic. A queen's last cloak. Around her wrist they tied a small prayer book. Her hair, once long and black as midnight, was tucked under a white linen coif. No crown. No jewels. She asked for no mirror. There was no one left to impress. Her beauty, once feared and worshipped, would be gone before the sun reached its peak. She did not eat. She did not ask for water. She asked only to write, and so she sat once more. This time at the small wooden table in the corner of the cell, a candle flickering in the stale air beside her. And she wrote what would become her final letter to the king, the man who had once broken Christendom for her, the man who had once called her his true love, his only desire, his star. She still addressed him with grace. She still called herself his most faithful wife. She begged for his soul's keeping, not for her own sake, but for his. And when she signed the letter, she did so without shaking, as if the act of dying had steadied her hands. They say her voice was soft that morning, not trembling, not sharp, just quiet, as if she were already drifting somewhere beyond the world. Halfway between tower and sky. She asked for no mercy. She asked for no reprieve. She only asked that the crowd would not be too close, that her daughter be looked after, and that the executioner, the French swordsman brought in specially for the task, be quick. She had heard he was skilled. She had been told he would not use an axe. And that, in itself, was the final act of cruelty the king had arranged for her to die with dignity. After destroying her name, they led her out of the room just before midday. The stone steps echoed beneath her shoes, each one worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, but never more so than by hers. Her ladies walked behind her, pale and red-eyed, carrying the cloth that would cover her body, the white linen that would receive her head. Anne did not look back. Her eyes stayed forward, fixed not on the sky, but on the wooden structure that rose like a stage in the centre of Tower Green. The scaffold had been freshly built, the straw already laid, the sword hidden from view behind a small block that waited for her neck. The crowd was larger than expected. Some watched with curiosity. Some looked away. Some cried. Anne climbed the steps slowly, her mantle catching once on a nail before she freed it with a quiet tug. She reached the top, stood at the centre, and turned to face those who had come to see the end of her. Her face, they say, was calm, her eyes clear. She did not scream. She did not faint. She did not curse. She simply spoke not long. Not loud, but enough. "I am come here to die," she said, "for according to the law, I am judged to die. I will speak nothing against it. But I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you. A gentler nor more merciful prince was there never." She did not mention her innocence. She did not accuse. But those who listened, and there were many, understood what she did not say. The queen had been condemned for nothing. The court had been a lie. The verdict had been chosen before the trial had begun. Her crime had been exhaustion. Her punishment erasure. She knelt in the straw. One of her ladies stepped forward and tied a blindfold gently around her eyes. Anne breathed once, whispered a final prayer. "Jesus, receive my soul." Then the Frenchman raised his sword, stepped forward, and struck in one clean movement. Her body fell to one side, her head rolled to the other. A cannon fired from the tower walls. The king had received his signal, and Anne Boleyn, once Queen of England, once mother of a princess, once the brightest woman in Europe, was no more. But death did not erase her. It never could. There are things that history forgets: battle dates, birth records, minor queens who vanished into marriage or madness. But there are things it refuses to let go of. Moments that echo louder the further they fall behind us. One such moment lies in a small room of stone, lit by a candle too dim for comfort. On the final morning of Anne Boleyn's life, she had already heard the hammering of wood on the cobblestones outside. She had already heard the muttered prayers of her ladies, the distant roll of wheels carrying the straw that would soon catch her blood. But before the blindfold, before the blade, before the cannon, she asked for paper, and she asked for ink, because Anne Boleyn, queen, prisoner, mother, had something left to say. The table was rough, the surface scarred with time. She sat in silence for a moment before the page, her fingers tracing the empty parchment, as though willing it to receive her last truth. Perhaps her hands shook at first, or perhaps they didn't. Perhaps the calm had already come. That strange stillness that only finds you once you've accepted the shape of your ending. What we do know is this. She began to write, slowly, carefully, with a clarity that was more heartbreaking than any scream. The letter was addressed to Henry, your Grace, as she still called him, and it did not accuse, did not beg, did not even ask for a reprieve. It asked only for remembrance. If ever I found favour in your sight, she wrote, if ever the name of Anne Boleyn has been pleasing in your ears, then let me obtain this request. She did not write as a traitor. She did not write as a seductress. She wrote as a wife, a woman who had carried the weight of a crown and the agony of its loss, who had borne a daughter in a palace where sons were currency, who had miscarried twice, and still whispered prayers into the darkness. A woman who, in the eyes of the court, was already a ghost. But she did not speak with vengeance. Her words were strange in their tenderness, haunted by betrayal, yet still clinging to love. Perhaps she hoped that somewhere beneath the iron mask of the king, the man who had once courted her with poems and promises still remained. Perhaps she wrote not to save herself, but to save what they had once been. She told him she would trouble him no further. She wrote of her prayers, not for herself, but for his grace, that God would keep him, guide him, forgive him. There was no bitterness in the lines, but between them, there was a grief deeper than any accusation, because only a woman who still loved could have written a letter like that, and only a man who had killed that love could have ignored it. Some historians question whether the letter was truly sent. Some say it was intercepted, burned, buried beneath the ashes of history by men who found her tenderness inconvenient. Others believe Henry received it and said nothing, never responded, never acknowledged it. Perhaps he could not bear to read it, or perhaps he had already erased her in his mind, replaced her name with Jane Seymour's, replaced Anne's final words with silence. But the letter survived, in fragments, in memory, in the reverent whispers of those who served her, in the way it was copied and recopied by those who understood what it meant to die, loyal. It became a relic not of royalty, but of humanity, a woman betrayed by the world, still reaching for the man who destroyed her. That letter is not just history, it is a wound on paper. She signed it, your most loyal and ever faithful wife. And in that signature, there was defiance. Not in anger, but in dignity. She refused to sign it as the former queen. She refused to call herself fallen, even with her death announced, her titles stripped, her friends executed, her daughter declared illegitimate. Anne still clung to the one truth. no trial could erase. She had been his wife. She had loved him. She had remained faithful, and she would carry that truth with her into death. Even if no one else spoke it aloud. When her ladies came to dress her, after the letter was written, they say she folded it herself, placed it gently in the hands of the constable, and asked only that it reach the king. No tears, no curses, just paper, and ink, and the final dignity of words. And then she turned from the table, and she never wrote again. The letter does not mention Elizabeth, but perhaps that is because Anne had already said goodbye to her in her heart. Long before the ink touched the page, she would have known that her child's future now lay in the hands of men who did not want her to exist, men who had erased her name from the line of succession, who had closed the doors of the nursery, who would never speak of her mother again except in shame. What could be said in a letter that would shield a child from a father's cruelty? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps only the hope that one day Elizabeth would know the truth, not just of how her mother died, but of how she had loved, and stayed loyal, and stood alone against the tide. And Elizabeth would know, because she would grow, and rise, and one day sit on the throne her mother never got to share. She would carry that letter, not in her hand, but in her blood, in her silence, in the way she refused to marry, in the way she ruled, in the way she wore Anne's ring and forbade any whisper against her mother's name. Anne's letter, though written to a king, was not for Henry. It was for the world that would come after, a world where ghosts remember, a world where words matter more than crowns, a world where silence is not the end, but the beginning. The crowd began to gather just after dawn, summoned not by trumpet nor decree, but by rumor, by curiosity, by something darker that seems to draw people to death, as if the end of a life might offer them some comfort about the uncertainty of their own. It was the 19th of May in the year 1536, and across the silent courtyard of the Tower of London, they came nobles in fine cloaks, who had once bowed to Anne Boleyn at court, merchants in stiff shoes, fishwives with raw hands, children lifted to their fathers' shoulders to better see the scaffold being hammered into place. No one smiled. No one spoke above a whisper. Some had come to witness justice. Others had come to witness mercy. But most, if they were honest, had come to see a queen die. Tower Green was not yet stained. The straw had been laid carefully, thick and clean, to muffle the sound of the fall, to soak the blood, to lend some last softness to a world that had turned hard. The scaffold stood higher than a man, built with speed, but not carelessness. Its planks nailed tight, its edges smoothed where the condemned might place her hands. Upon it stood nothing yet but a small wooden block, and behind it, unseen by the crowd, a slender French sword longer than an axe, faster than judgment. It had arrived from Calais days earlier, carried by a man known for his discretion, a swordsman who had never failed to deliver death in silence. He would not speak to her. He would not make her kneel twice. His purpose was singular: to take a head and leave a legend. Anne Boleyn knew all of this. She had been told the details, perhaps gently, perhaps not. She had asked no questions when the arrangements were described. She had simply nodded and waited, and when the hour came, not at sunrise, not at noon, but somewhere in the quiet space between, she stood, wrapped in grey wool and an ermine mantle, her hair tucked beneath a white cap, a small prayer book tied at her waist. Her face, they say, was calm. Her steps, steady. Her voice, if it spoke at all, was meant for God alone. The walk from her cell to the scaffold took less than 3 minutes. 3 minutes through the stone passage, past the chapel where she had prayed that morning, across the same courtyard where she had once laughed with her ladies in waiting, past the window from which she had once watched the king's ships on the Thames, 3 minutes in which every step echoed louder than the last, and every eye turned to her not with hatred, not with scorn, but with something close to mourning, because by now, even the cruelest among them knew the truth that whatever sins had been imagined, whatever lies had been whispered into the king's ear, this woman had not deserved to die. When Anne reached the base of the scaffold, she paused. A gentleman offered his hand. She refused it. She climbed alone. The platform creaked slightly beneath her, as all wood does before it remembers its purpose. She turned to the crowd, and for a moment, just a moment, she scanned the faces. Some were crying. Some were stone. A few mouths moved in silent prayer. One child whispered, "She's so small." Then Anne Boleyn began to speak. "I'm come here to die," she said softly. "For according to the law, I am judged to die, and I will speak nothing against it." She paused. The wind moved gently through her mantle. "But I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you." Her voice did not tremble. A gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never. She would not confess to what she had not done. She would not give them the comfort of apology, and she would not curse the man who had once promised her forever. That, in itself, was her final triumph. She turned then and knelt in the straw. Her ladies moved swiftly. One, removing her mantle. Another lifting the hem of her gown to spare her dignity. A third stepping forward with the blindfold. Anne did not resist. She accepted the cloth over her eyes as though accepting the closing of a curtain. Her hands found the block with quiet familiarity. She leaned forward, and then, in her final breath, she whispered, "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." The swordsman waited. In French, he murmured to his assistant, "A small instruction? A ruse. Bring me the sword." And as Anne turned slightly in instinct, thinking the blade still lay behind her, he raised it high above his shoulder and brought it down in one clean stroke. There was no cry, no struggle, no second blow, only silence, and then the sound of something soft falling into straw. A cannon fired from the tower's outer wall, the signal to the king that it was done, that Anne Boleyn, Queen, Mother, scandal, legend had ceased to breathe. But even in that, there was one last cruelty. Henry had not ordered a coffin. Sir William Kingston, the tower's constable, stood helpless for a moment before sending for the only thing he could find, an old arrow chest. Rough, narrow, too short for a woman's body. Her ladies, weeping now, wrapped her head in a white cloth. They lifted her gently, lowered her into the box, placed the head beneath her arm. The lid was nailed shut without ceremony. There was no prayer, no procession, no royal farewell. She was buried beside the chapel wall, nameless, as if the earth might forget what the court had done. But the earth did not forget, nor did the stone, nor did the wind that blows through the tower still, and neither did the crowd. Because they had watched her walk with dignity, they had heard her speak with mercy, they had seen her die without flinching, and in their hearts, they knew something had gone terribly wrong. The Queen was dead, but something else had begun, something that would not end with silence. The sword had fallen, the cannon had sounded, and the world should have moved on. A queen had died, a name had been struck from the court registers, a new woman, quiet, pale, compliant, waited in the wings, already fitted for the crown that still lay warm with blood. But something was wrong, not in the air, though it was still and heavy, not in the crowd, though many wept silently behind their sleeves, and not in the ground, though it had drunk its fill of royal blood before. No, what was wrong that morning was something so ordinary, so overlooked, that it felt like a whisper from the very soul of history itself. They had forgotten a coffin. Sir William Kingston stood at the edge of the scaffold, stiff-backed and silent. The Tower's constable, whose duty it was to ensure that justice, or the thing they now called justice, was carried out with dignity. He had seen men for treason, women for secrets, noble lords for ambition, commonness for breath. He had seen heads roll and blood spill, and prayers screamed into empty air. But never had he seen a queen laid low like this. And now, as the executioner wiped his sword and the crowd began to disperse, eyes lowered and shoulders hunched, Kingston was left with a problem that should never have existed: where to put the body. Anne Boleyn lay still, her head wrapped in white linen, her body curled gently by the hands of the ladies who had loved her to the end. She did not bleed much. The French blade had been clean, swift, brutal in its precision. Her dress, once grey, now darkened at the neck, the fabric clinging to her in folds like a last embrace. The straw beneath her rustled only with the wind. The silence pressed in, and no coffin came. There had been no order from the king, no woodcut, no carriage prepared, no resting place. And so, Kingston sent a boy to fetch the only thing he could think of: an arrow chest. It was an old box, rough-hewn, once used to store bolts and arrows for the archers on the tower walls. It was not made for a queen. It was too short, too narrow, too plain. The inside still smelled faintly of oil and iron, but it was the only thing the tower could offer the woman for whom the Reformation had begun. The ladies brought her body forward with care, their sleeves soaked, their lips moving in soundless prayer. One held Anne's head gently, reverently, as if cradling a sleeping child. They placed her inside the chest, folding her legs slightly, to fit, curling her hands over her stomach, tucking her severed head beneath one arm. There was no space for grace, no time for ritual. The box did not close cleanly. A soldier had to press down the lid with his knee, as another hammered the nails in place. There was no procession, no tolling bell, no mass. The arrow chest was lowered into the earth near the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, beneath the floor stones where hundreds would later walk. Unaware of who lay there, the burial was quiet, brutal, and final. A patch of disturbed dirt was raked flat. The straw was burned, the scaffold taken down before nightfall, and by the time the sun had set over the Thames, there was no visible trace that Anne Boleyn had ever existed. But the tower remembered, and it would not be silent. That night, the guards spoke in hushed voices of strange sounds on the green footsteps with no shadow. A woman's breath beneath the wind, the rustling of silk in an empty chamber. One man swore he saw her face in the window of the Queen's lodgings. Another claimed the chapel glowed from within, though no candle had been lit. And over the years, the stories multiplied. Anne Boleyn walking headless through the tower grounds. Anne Boleyn kneeling in prayer before the altar where she had once wept. Anne Boleyn drifting across Tower Green with her hands clasped, or worse, with her severed head held gently in her palms like a terrible crown. And always, she was silent, because death had not given her back her voice. It had only made her visible, in a way she had never been before. Some say she haunts the tower because of the injustice, that she died innocent, framed by those who feared her power, destroyed by the husband who once promised her eternity. Others say she remains because her body was not laid to rest with dignity, because the arrow chest, that crude box of war, is too small to hold the weight of her soul. But there are some who believe she walks not out of rage, but out of remembrance, that she wanders the stone paths and chapel walls not to frighten, but to remind that her presence is not a curse, but a testimony, because Anne Boleyn did not vanish. She was not erased. She became something else entirely. She became a warning, a wound, a whisper in the dark that power, once given, cannot be unmade without consequence. And the coffin or lack thereof is part of that story. A queen, who had once stood at the right hand of the most powerful man in Europe, who had once worn a crown carved with Tudor roses and spoke with the voice of a nation, was buried like a common criminal in a soldier's crate. Not even her bones would be marked. Her daughter Elizabeth would one day rule the world, but Anne was laid in earth, nameless, faceless, forgotten by the man who had once broken his country just to hold her hand. And so, she carries her head. Still, because history tried to bury her, but she rose again. Not in flesh, but in memory, and no coffin, not even the deepest, can hold a story that refuses to die. The sword that ended Anne Boleyn's life was clean, on foreign, and paid for by the crown she once wore. But the real weapon that killed her was something far more English, a lie, carefully crafted, shaped by fear, wielded by a man who never once raised a blade. His name was Thomas Cromwell, the king's most trusted minister, a lawyer by training, a strategist by nature, a man who could write in Latin as fluently as he could erase a name from the court's memory. And in the spring of the year 1536, Cromwell found himself facing a problem too dangerous to solve. With parchment alone, the king wanted Anne gone. And this time, silence would not be enough. Anne had failed. That was the word that floated like ash through the corridors of Whitehall and Westminster. Not because she had broken a law, but because her womb had betrayed the promise it once held. She had given Henry a daughter Elizabeth, but no son. And worse, she had miscarried 3 times. Her final loss coming just weeks after a quarrel in which Henry, for the first time, let slip the shadow of doubt. A dead child, a fading queen, and a court already whispering that the king had turned his gaze toward another Jane Seymour. Soft-spoken, obedient, untouched. And when a king begins to dream of peace, the woman who once brought fire becomes a threat. Catherine of Aragon had been too powerful to simply discard. Her bloodline reached across Europe. Her nephew was Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. Henry had battled the Pope himself for years just to be free of her. And even then, he dared not lay a finger upon her. But Anne, for all her brilliance, her influence, her cleverness stood alone. Her family had no armies. Her allies had dwindled, and the king had begun to regret the chaos she had brought. Cromwell saw this, and he understood the king better than the king understood himself. Henry would not be satisfied with divorce. He would need something cleaner, something final, something that could make the people forget that he had once broken an empire to marry her. So Cromwell began to whisper. He summoned men who had once served in Anne's chambers, musicians, poets, pages, friends. He questioned them not for truth, but for weakness. He sent them home, shaken, summoned them back again, twisted their words into evidence, their loyalty into confession. He claimed that Anne had taken lovers not 1, not 2, but 5, that she had betrayed the king not only in body, but in soul, that she had even plotted to poison him, to murder him, to marry again before his corpse had cooled, and most scandalous of all, that she had slept with her own brother, George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, a man as brilliant and proud as she was, and just as doomed. It was absurd. Anne had lived every day of her marriage under watch, surrounded by ladies in waiting, guarded by servants, monitored by rivals. There were no stolen nights, no secret meetings. Her alleged lovers were men of court, known to her. Yes, some who had danced with her, some who had read her poetry, one who had given her a gift at New Year's. But the evidence was air. The charges were dust. And yet, Cromwell had no need for truth. He had a king's favour. He had frightened men. He had the Tower. He had the gallows. One by one, the men were arrested. Mark Smeaton, the court musician, confessed first under what pressure? We will never know. But the signs were there. In the change of his tone. In the way he answered questions before they were asked. Then came Henry Norris. A groom of the stool. Loyal to the king. Then Sir Francis Weston and William Brereton. Both courtiers. Finally, George Anne's brother. Her ally. Her reflection. Some were tortured. All were lied to. The accusations were outlandish. Contradictory. Impossible. But by the time they stood trial, the verdict had already been chosen. Anne watched from the tower. She was told nothing. Then told everything. She was allowed no lawyer, no witnesses, no mercy. She was charged with 21 counts of adultery, incest, and treason. The evidence was dates that could not match, testimonies from men already condemned. And the court's hunger for a spectacle, Anne stood in the great hall of the tower, facing a jury made of her enemies, including her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. And still, she did not weep. She stood straight. She spoke clearly. She denied every charge. She offered to be examined by doctors to prove she had never been unfaithful. She asked to confront her accusers. She demanded that her name be cleared. For her sake, for her daughters, for the truth. But the court did not want the truth. It wanted a queen to die. The verdict was guilty. The sentence to be burned or beheaded. At the king's pleasure, the men were executed first. George Boleyn died bravely, denying everything. His final words laced with dignity. Though his final humiliation was cruel beyond measure, a list of his supposed crimes read aloud as he waited for the axe. The whispers of incest echoing through the crowd. Mark Smeaton, the only one who confessed, was said to look broken as he climbed the scaffold. Weston and Brereton died silently. Henry Norris died loyal. All of them were innocent. All of them were used. Anne's sentence was changed. Not burning, but beheading. A gift. They called it mercy. But mercy does not wear a crown of lies. And the lie that killed Anne was not that she had committed adultery, or murder, or treason. The real lie, the one that cut deeper than any blade, was that her voice didn't matter, that her story could be rewritten. Her name turned to scandal. Her daughter cast aside. That a woman who had once stood at the centre of England's storm could be turned into silence. But silence is not forgetting. And Anne Boleyn was not made for silence. She faced her death with grace, not because she accepted guilt, but because she knew the truth was louder than the lies. And now, all these centuries later, it is the lie that has died. Not her. She was not there when it happened. She did not hear the cannon. She did not see the sword fall. She did not see the men carry her mother's body away in an arrow, chest too narrow for dignity. But she felt it not in memory, for she was only 2 years and 8 months old. Not old enough to remember, but just old enough to lose. Her name was Elizabeth. Princess of England one day, bastard the next. And though she would become a queen, though she would one day reign over the most brilliant court England had ever known, her story would begin not with a coronation but with a silence so heavy it split her life in two. She was likely at Hatfield when the end came. A great country house, surrounded by green fields and cold stone, where the servants spoke softly in the halls and avoided eye contact with the little girl whose future had just been erased by royal decree. One day she was called Your Grace. The next, simply Lady Elizabeth. One day, her tutors bowed lower. Her rooms warmed more quickly. Her cradle sat beneath banners of red and white. The Tudor rose interlaced with her mother's falcon. The next, all of it disappeared. They didn't tell her. Of course they didn't. How could they? How do you tell a child that her mother has been accused of sleeping with 5 men, including her own brother? That she was tried in a court where no one listened? That she died, kneeling on a wooden scaffold, while a crowd watched with tears in their throats and shame in their eyes. How do you tell a child that her father, the king, ordered the blade, that the man who once promised the world to her mother now refused to say her name? They didn't have to tell her. She would know it anyway. She would know it in the way the women stopped touching her hair, in the way no one spoke of the Queen anymore, though her portrait still hung in the room outside the nursery, in the way the courtiers whispered when she passed, in the way the servants looked away when she laughed, as if joy had become dangerous, as if love itself had become a treasonous thing. Her mother's belongings vanished. The letters were burned, the yevils sized, the tapestries taken down, the initials H and A once carved into the walls of Hampton Court, twined together in stone, were hammered out and replaced with Jane Seymour's badge. Even Anne's name was spoken only in darkness, as if to utter it aloud might summon her ghost too early. But Elizabeth remembered, not with pictures, not with words, but with absence. The absence of arms that once held her, the absence of a voice that once sang to her, the absence of a promise that said, "I will always be here," and then wasn't. And that absence shaped her like nothing else ever would. She learned quickly not to ask, not to cry, not to show weakness. She was bright, too bright for her age. And even as a child, she understood that she could not be soft in a world that had no mercy for women without protection. Her father had moved on. Jane Seymour had given him a son, then died. Catherine Howard had smiled too often, and died. Catherine Parr survived by reading scripture and standing perfectly still. Elizabeth learned all of this in silence, and she watched. She watched the way men spoke over women, the way queens were adored one moment and forgotten the next. She watched the way her mother's name was never written, how no one at court dared say Boleyn with pride, how even her teachers hesitated when they spoke of her lineage. But Elizabeth did not flinch. She remembered her mother through the things that survived in secret, a ring with a tiny portrait hidden inside, worn always on her finger, a gift never explained, a miniature painting kept locked away in her private chambers, never displayed, but always nearby, a silence that became a sanctuary. And when she finally rose to power, when the country that had once called her illegitimate crowned her with thunderous joy, when the golden canopy was held above her head and the anointing oil traced her forehead, she did not forget. She did not say Anne's name in public. She did not demand a tomb, but she made sure no one ever spoke against her again. She made herself everything her mother had been denied. Elizabeth was careful, calculating, shrewd beyond her years. She never married. She never placed her trust in any man. She ruled alone, not because she was incapable of love, but because she had seen what love had done to her mother. She had learned that to belong to a man, even a king, was to place your life in his hands. And Anne Boleyn had learned too late that those hands could close into fists. And still, Elizabeth found ways to honor her. Quiet ways, powerful ways. She filled her court with scholars, poets, painters, thinkers, the very world Anne had dreamed of. She became the Virgin Queen, not because she feared love, but because she feared what it had cost Anne. She wore red and white, not just for Tudor, but for the blood spilled to give her life. She ruled with fire and intelligence and iron. And in the shadow of her mother's execution, she gave England a golden age. Anne Boleyn died when Elizabeth was not yet 3 years old. But she never truly left her. She lived in every decision Elizabeth made, in every man she outwitted, in every time she turned away from marriage proposals wrapped in political silk. She lived in the refusal to be small, in the refusal to be silent, in the refusal to die. And when Elizabeth died in the year 1603, she carried no regrets. She had never seen her mother in life, but in death, they would be remembered together. One lost, one victorious, both unforgettable. Because Anne Boleyn left behind more than a daughter, She left behind a flame that even 500 years of lies could not extinguish. Ghosts are not always bound by chains or walls. Some walk where they died. Others return to where they loved. Some come to terrify. Others to remember. But the ghost of Anne Boleyn does something stranger than all of these. She returns again and again, not only to the place where her life ended, but to the places where she once believed it had only just begun. And unlike most spirits, she does not whisper. She appears again and again, dressed in silk, sometimes white, sometimes black, sometimes red, but always unmistakable, always a queen. The Tower of London is where most see her first. It is the place of blood, of betrayal, of that soft thud of a severed head hitting straw. They say that late at night, the air grows colder on Tower Green than anywhere else inside the fortress. That you can hear footsteps when no one is walking. That you can feel someone watching when you are alone. And those who are brave or foolish enough to look say they have seen her figure, pale and graceful, gliding silently from the Queen's house toward the scaffold. Retracing that final walk, she moves with dignity, even in death. Her hands sometimes folded, sometimes carrying something round and white and wrapped her head. She never speaks, but she does not need to. The stone remembers her voice. In the year 1864, a soldier fainted on duty after lunging with his bayonet at a figure he swore was a headless woman. His superiors prepared to punish him until his commanding officer, Captain Dundas, stepped forward and confirmed the story. He too had seen her, a woman in white, drifting across the ground like mist, with no face, nor eyes, nor breath. And once you've seen Anne Boleyn at the Tower, you do not forget her, because she does not let you. But the Tower is not her only haunt. There is a place in Norfolk, deep in the countryside, called Blickling Hall. Today it is a stately home, with manicured gardens and red brick walls, quiet and serene. But on the night of May 19th, the anniversary of her death, it becomes something else. Every year, at the exact hour of her execution, locals report the same vision. A coach, black as coal, and pulled by 4 headless horses, comes roaring up the long driveway. The driver, also headless, does not speak. Inside the carriage, a woman sits alone. At first she is dressed in shimmering white, but as the coach slows, her gown begins to change. Not by magic, but by memory. The silk stains, red blooming like roses across her lap. And there, resting in her hands, is her head, her mouth open, screaming, her face contorted not in pain, but in fury. Blickling was where she was born, where she was a child, where she once ran through gardens without knowing she would be queen, or lose her life at 35, or be remembered more for how she died than how she lived. Perhaps that is why she returns here, not as the woman who lost everything, but as the girl who still had it all. Then there is Hampton Court, the palace Henry built and rebuilt, where the walls once rang with Anne's laughter and later echoed with orders for her arrest. It was at Hampton Court that she reigned. Briefly, as queen, her initials carved into stone beside his. H and A, Henry and Anne, intertwined, forever, until it ended. After her death, Henry had every image of her removed portraits burned, emblems scraped off walls, her family crest erased. Even the carvings of H and A were chiseled out, replaced with the badge of Jane Seymour, as if stone could forget, as if the past could be rewritten by hammer and shame. But Anne still walks there. She wears dark gowns now, not white, not blood-stained, and is often seen moving through the palace's oldest corridors, through doors that no longer open, along staircases that were sealed centuries ago. She is seen alone, always searching, always drifting past the chambers she was meant to inhabit as queen but never did. Some guards say she walks through walls. Others say they've heard her crying. But most agree on this: she is not lost. She is looking for something that was promised and stolen. Perhaps her crown. Perhaps her child. Perhaps the life that ended before it ever truly began. But not all her appearances are filled with horror. There is one place where Anne is peaceful: Hever Castle, her childhood home, nestled in the green of Kent, surrounded by still waters and ancient trees, is where she returns. Not as a queen or a ghost, but as a girl. It is here, around Christmas, that she is most often seen walking beneath the old oaks, her dress soft and white, her hands empty, her face calm. She does not carry her head here. She does not bleed. There is no wind, no scream, not dread, only quiet, only memory. This is where Henry first courted her, where the letters came sealed in wax, scented, signed H.R., where she once believed in love, believed in destiny, believed that being chosen meant being protected. She was wrong. But perhaps, in this place, she can remember the girl she was before the crown, before the scaffold, before the silence. Some say ghosts return to finish what was left undone. Others say they linger because we cannot forget them. But Anne Boleyn's hauntings are not all the same. At the Tower, she reminds us of injustice. At Blickling, she reminds us of innocence. At Hampton Court, she reminds us of betrayal. At Hever, she reminds us that once, just once, she was happy. And maybe that's what makes her ghost different. She is not just one memory. She is all of them. A girl, a queen, a prisoner, a mother, a myth, a warning. And as long as we remember the places she walked in life and in death, she will keep walking, not to frighten, but to be remembered. Death was meant to erase her. That was the point. That was the plan. When Anne Boleyn knelt in the straw on Tower Green on the morning of May the 19th, in the year 1536, her death was supposed to be the last word, not only on her life, but on her legacy, the axe, or in her case, the sword, was meant to sever more than a neck. It was meant to sever memory, sever sympathy, sever the thread of a story that had become too dangerous, too complicated, too loud. She had to go, and so she was taken. But history is stubborn, and ghosts are louder than kings. And Anne Boleyn, headless though she became, would not be silenced. In the hours that followed her death, her name was scrubbed from every surface. Her portraits vanished from the walls. Her crest was burned. Her servants were dismissed. The initials she had once shared with Henry carved into stone, stitched into tapestries, written into England itself, were hacked out or replaced. Even the word Queen was no longer attached to her. In public, she became a warning. In court, she became a curse. And for the little girl she left behind, she became an absence so heavy that it could not be spoken aloud. But the silence did not hold, because history, like the dead, has a way of rising. The child who lost everything, who had her name changed, her title stripped, her mother erased, grew up watching every move, listening to every lie, surviving every political shift without ever raising her voice. And when she rose to power, when Elizabeth Tudor was crowned Queen of England in the year 1558, more than 2 decades after Anne's execution, it was not just a daughter ascending the throne. It was a ghost reclaiming her place in the world. Anne had been buried in a chest without a name. But now her blood wore a crown. Elizabeth never spoke publicly of her mother's death. She rarely even mentioned her by name. The court was full of people who had either helped to condemn Anne or had remained silent while she fell. Elizabeth could not afford to confront them directly, but she did not need to. Her very reign was a rebuke to everything they had tried to destroy. She refused to marry. She refused to give any man control over her body or her kingdom. She ruled as her mother never could alone. Unchallenged and immortal, her court became a place of brilliance, of music and philosophy and art. She revived England, not with armies, but with ideas. And every time she stood before her people in her white gowns and jeweled collars, she brought her mother back to life. In private, the signs were clearer. She wore a ring that opened to reveal two portraits, one of herself and one of Anne Boleyn, delicate and idealized, painted not as a traitor, but as a queen. She kept Anne's memory close, hidden in jewelry, in locked chambers, in the language of silence turned sacred. And though she never built a grand tomb for her mother, though she never held a public mass in her name, she protected Anne with something far more powerful authority. Under Elizabeth, it became dangerous to insult Anne Boleyn. No one dared call her a whore. No one dared repeat the charges of treason. No one dared question the legitimacy of the queen who had come from her. And though Elizabeth never declared it, everyone understood the ghost of Anne Boleyn had returned, not in midnight wanderings, but in royal command. Her story had not ended at the scaffold. It had simply changed form. Still, the ghost did not rest. If anything, her presence grew stronger. After Elizabeth died in the year 1603, Anne Boleyn's spirit seemed to stir again in the world of the living. The Tower Guards continued to report sightings, a woman in white walking silently across the green, vanishing before she reached the place where her body had fallen. At Blickling Hall, the phantom coach came louder, faster, more frequent. At Hampton Court, her steps could be heard on stairs that no longer existed. And at Hever Castle, in the gardens where she had once believed in love, she still appeared on winter nights, unbloody, undisturbed, as if remembering a version of herself that never made it to the scaffold. But these hauntings are not just flickers of the past. They are a protest. Anne Boleyn is not the ghost of punishment. She is the ghost of injustice. She walks not because she wants to frighten, but because there is something in her story that demands to be told again and again. She was not guilty. Her trial was a lie. Her death was political. Her daughter was her victory. Her silence was forced. Her memory was nearly destroyed. But she survived not in tombs, but in truth. And perhaps that is why she is seen more than any other spirit in England. Because we keep telling her story. We keep trying to make sense of the woman who was worshipped and destroyed, crowned and discarded, adored and betrayed. We keep returning to the question of how a king could tear a country apart for love, and then take a sword to the woman he had once called his angel. We keep wondering whether justice can ever be real when power decides what justice means. Anne Boleyn's ghost is not a warning about death. It is a warning about forgetting, because the moment we stop telling her story is the moment she is lost. And she refuses to be lost. So she walks in books, in ballads, in whispered legends. She appears in films, in art, in memory. She haunts not only stone and air, but language itself. Every time we speak her name, she is present. Every time we tell a child about a queen who died for nothing, she listens. Every time we ask what truth costs, we are asking about Anne Boleyn. She failed as Henry's queen, but through Elizabeth, she became the mother of modern England, the Virgin Queen. The defeat of the Spanish Armada, the age of Shakespeare and Drake and Raleigh, it all begins with Anne. With a woman who dared to say no, with a woman who demanded more, with a woman who paid the price and still refuses to be silenced. The next time you visit the Tower of London, stand still at Tower Green. Let the wind pass. Let the air settle. Look at the space between the chapel and the scaffold. And if you see a figure there in white, in silence, in sorrow, do not be afraid. It is not a ghost. It is history, refusing to stay buried. It is a queen walking still